I never liked walking into that house. Every holiday, every family gathering, it was the same performance. The walls were painted warm colors, the chandeliers polished to gleam, but to me, the place always felt colder than any boardroom I'd ever entered. My wife would hold my hand at the door, squeezing lightly as if to say, "Be patient, endure, it'll be over soon." I didn't speak of it often, but I knew what awaited me beyond that door. Her family didn't see me as her husband, they saw me as an outsider. Someone who had slipped through the cracks, lucky to be accepted into their bloodline. They masked their disdain with politeness when my wife was near, but the moment she left the room, their real thoughts showed in the way they dismissed me, the way they rolled their eyes when I spoke, or the way they gave me tasks no different from a hired hand. That night was no exception. The moment I stepped inside, the air thickened with forced greetings. A few handshakes, a couple of pats on the back, but never the kind that welcomed me as family. It was the kind you'd give to someone delivering groceries, transactional, dismissive. Dinner was already in motion. The table stretched long and wide, filled with polished silverware and glasses that sparkled under the light. Laughter rolled down its length like waves. I caught snippets of conversations about vacations, promotions, and expensive purchases. Every voice competed with the other, each eager to outshine. I took my seat, or rather, I thought I would. But before I could even pull out a chair, one of the uncles leaned back and said, "Oh, you'll be carving tonight." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even phrased as a request. It was an order dressed in tradition, the kind of tradition they invented on the spot just to remind me of where I stood. A few chuckled. Another added, "And you know the relations-in-law eat in the kitchen. Leave the main table for the family." They laughed louder this time. I looked at my wife. She shifted uncomfortably, opened her mouth to speak, but her mother touched her arm with a smile that warned her not to cause a scene. That was always the way of things here. Appearances mattered more than fairness, dignity, or respect. So I said nothing. I walked to the head of the table, where the turkey sat glistening, golden skin crackling with juices underneath. I picked up the carving knife and fork, steadied my hand, and began slicing. The blade moved cleanly, each cut precise, revealing tender white meat beneath. I'd done this before, in 100 different setting, client dinners, fundraisers, even quiet meals at home. But never had I done it with an audience waiting to belittle me for simply obeying. The room filled with chatter again, but my ears filtered it differently this time. Every laugh felt like it carried an undertone aimed at me. Every boast about their successes sounded like it was being thrown in my direction, a reminder of where they thought I stood, beneath them. The irony wasn't lost on me. If I wanted, I could have silenced the entire table with a single sentence. I could have reminded them that the businesses they admired, the companies they bragged about owning stock in, answered to me. That behind the suit they dismissed and the quiet demeanor they misread, I was the man steering futures they couldn't even fathom. But I didn't. I never had. Because power wasn't something you shouted about, it was something you carried, quietly, patiently, until the world stumbled upon it and froze in recognition. So I carved in silence. Piece by piece, I filled the platter, passing it to hands that didn't thank me, only nodded with entitlement. A cousin leaned back and said, "Not bad, guess you're good for something after all." More laughter followed, spilling down the table like sour wine. I kept my expression still. That was my greatest weapon, the stillness. Minutes stretched. I could feel my wife's discomfort growing with each passing joke, but I gave her a small nod when our eyes met. I wanted her to know I wasn't breaking. I had endured worse than this, far worse, in the years it took me to reach where I stood now. And then it happened. A knock at the door. Firm, confident. The room quieted slightly, curiosity flickering in their voices. One of the family members went to answer it, and in stepped the wealthiest guest of the evening, the man everyone wanted to impress. He was a figure of immense influence, known in the circles that mattered. The kind of man whose presence alone could change the entire tone of a gathering. He entered with his usual composure, scanning the room with a polite smile before his eyes landed on me. And in that instant, the balance shifted. He walked straight past the cousins who were ready to flatter him, past the uncles with their forced grins, past my in-laws, who had already risen to greet him. He came directly to me, still holding the carving knife in my hand, and extended his hand warmly. "Good to see you, Mr.Ceo," he said, his voice carrying enough weight to silence the room. "The board's waiting on you." The words hung in the air like thunder after lightning. I shook his hand firmly, my face calm, my movements measured, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Around me, I could feel the ripple of shock spreading across the table. Forks paused midair. Smiles stiffened, then froze entirely. The laughter that had filled the room moments before was gone. And though I didn't say a word, the silence said everything. The silence after his words was almost deafening. For years, I had grown accustomed to being the man overlooked in this house, the shadow in the corner, the one invited because my wife insisted but never truly welcomed. But in that moment, the silence carried something new: recognition, shock, a dawning awareness that every slight, every joke at my expense, had been aimed at the wrong target. I let the handshake linger just long enough to make its weight undeniable. The carving knife still rested in my other hand, the absurdity of it striking even me for a fleeting second. Here I stood, apron slightly dusted with turkey juices, the family's self-appointed servant for the evening, being addressed not as a tag-along husband, but as the man at the helm of a boardroom they all envied from afar. The guest leaned back slightly, his eyes scanning the frozen faces around the table before settling back on me. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight," he said with a chuckle. "I assumed you'd already be on the call with the overseas partners. But I'm glad I caught you before business pulls you away again." His words struck the room like a second lightning bolt. Overseas partners. Business calls. Words foreign in this dining room, yet instantly familiar to me. I smiled faintly, keeping my tone measured. "The call's later tonight. I thought I'd make time for family first." It was a deliberate choice of words. Family first. A reminder, subtle yet sharp, that this table had treated me like anything but. The guest pulled out a chair beside mine without asking permission, an action so natural yet so intrusive to the family's hierarchy that I caught several of them exchanging uneasy glances. That seat wasn't supposed to be for me. It certainly wasn't supposed to be for him. But now, both of us occupied the head of the table, and the unspoken order of things was shattered. "So," he said, resting his elbows lightly on the table as though he had come here solely to speak with me, "how's the latest expansion? I read the report's impressive numbers, especially considering the market." I could feel the heat of stares pressing in from every angle. The same mouths that had laughed at me minutes ago were now sealed shut, straining to absorb words that didn't belong to their narrative of who I was. "It's steady," I replied simply. "Challenges, of course, but that's the nature of growth." "Steady?" He laughed warmly. "That's modest. What you've done in the last 2 years alone is being studied by analysts. You've practically redefined leadership in a turbulent industry." Gasps weren't audible, but the air shifted with sharp intakes of breath. My wife's hand tightened slightly on her napkin. I saw her eyes glisten with something that wasn't sorpresa she had always known, but relief. Relief that, finally, the truth was out in the open, no longer ours alone. Around the table, the cousins who had mocked me earlier avoided eye contact, their forks suddenly fascinating. The uncle who had ordered me to carve the turkey now cleared his throat nervously, attempting to sip his wine as though nothing had changed. But everything had. I leaned back slightly, adopting the same posture I used in boardrooms when negotiations turned in my favor. I didn't need to gloat. Power has its own gravity. Once revealed, it pulls everything toward it without effort. The guest continued. I remember the first time I saw your projections, half the board thought they were too ambitious. But you proved them wrong every single time. That's why we trust you. Leadership like yours is rare. I nodded, the words washing over me not as flattery, but as confirmation. They were truths I lived daily, though truths this room had never allowed me to speak. The family squirmed in silence. I could feel their thoughts clawing for explanations. How could he be the CEO? How could we not have known? Why didn't she tell us? Their pride was cracking, the polished surface of superiority splintering under the weight of reality. I remembered then the first holiday dinner I had attended in this very room years ago. I had been younger, quieter, still climbing the ladder, but already building the foundation of what would become my empire. Back then, their treatment of me had stung more deeply. The dismissive remarks, the forced seating in the kitchen, the way they introduced me vaguely as her husband, without ever asking about my work. One of the cousins had once joked, "So what do you really do? Must be nice to have time off while the rest of us work." I had smiled then too, choosing silence over correction, because I knew with a certainty that burned that time would reveal everything. And tonight it had. The guest asked me question after question, pulling me into a conversation that eclipsed the entire table. He wanted insights, projections, my thoughts on the global economy. I answered with the same calm precision I gave my executives, each response drawing him deeper into dialogue. The rest of the family? They listened. Not by choice, but because they had no alternative. Aunt, who had prided herself on being the sharpest in the room, now sat wide-eyed, her fork untouched. The same cousin who had laughed at my carving skill leaned forward, as though taking notes, desperate to catch fragments of the conversation. It was almost poetic, these people, who had pushed me aside, now reduced to silent students in the classroom of my reality. But I didn't revel in it. I didn't need to. My dignity wasn't restored in their eyes. It had never left mine. The guest eventually leaned back, satisfied. "You know, I've always admired how you balance things," he said. "The business world can consume a man, but you've managed to hold onto your values. That's rare." I gave a small smile. "It helps to remember where you started." The words hung heavy, because I wasn't speaking only to him. I was speaking to everyone in that room. Remember where you started. Remember the arrogance, the condescension, the laughter at someone you believed beneath you. Dinner continued, though it was no longer the same dinner. The conversation shifted, cautious now, filled with forced attempts at including me. "So," one of the uncles finally asked, clearing his throat, "you've been busy, haven't you?" Busy. The understatement of the century. "Yes," I replied evenly, "but never too busy for family." It was a deliberate knife twist, though my tone remained soft, because I wanted them to sit with the reality that while they had treated me like an outsider, I had still made the effort to be present. My wife's eyes met mine then, pride shimmering in them. For years, she had carried the weight of their treatment too, silently defending me in private, urging me not to let it sour my heart. And now, finally, she saw the shift. But I wasn't done. Not yet. The guest leaned toward me again. "You'll be at the conference next month?" "Of course," I said. "I'll be presenting the keynote." "Excellent," he replied. "The entire board is eager to hear you. And frankly, the press is too. They're calling you the architect of the next era." The family's frozen smile strained even tighter. Architect of the next era. To hear their wealthiest guest attach those words to me, the man they had relegated to carving duties, was a blow they couldn't disguise. And I didn't need to look at them to know the thought crossing every mind. We misjudged him. We underestimated him. We mocked the very man we should have respected most. But their realization didn't change the past. I sat quietly, eating little, listening more than I spoke. Because the power wasn't in the words, it was in the silence that followed them. The meal resumed, but the air had transformed into something thick, almost suffocating. Moments earlier, the table had been filled with laughter that cut like glass, dismissive jokes served alongside. The turkey. Now, those same mouths barely dared to open, each bite taken in silence, each glance cautiously directed my way, as though I were a stranger who had just unmasked himself. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I never did. In business, I'd learned that silence is often louder than words. It unsettles people, forces them to confront their own discomfort. And here, it was working perfectly. The guest beside me filled the quiet effortlessly, asking questions about markets, about long-term strategies, about trends others in the room couldn't even pronounce. He spoke with the familiarity of someone who had worked alongside me, who respected me, who knew what I had built. Each question he asked was another hammer blow against the carefully constructed image my in-laws had painted of me as insignificant. "What's your take on the Asian expansion?" he asked casually, sipping his wine. "Some analysts think it's risky, but you've always had a sense for timing." I set down my fork, wiping my hands slowly on the napkin before answering. "Risk is the shadow of opportunity," I said. "If you wait for certainty, you'll be too late. Timing isn't about avoiding risk, it's about knowing which risks are worth staking your name on." He smiled, nodding in satisfaction. "Spoken like a man who's already proven it." The words weren't meant for them, but they landed on the family like stones dropped into still water. I could see it in the flicker of their eyes, the stiffness of their posture. For years, they had sat around this table boasting of promotions, of investments, of trivial gains in their careers. And now, here they were, listening to a conversation that existed in a realm far beyond theirs, a world they had mocked me for never being a part of. One of the uncles finally cleared his throat, forcing a smile. "Well, it sounds like you've been busy." The understatement was almost comical. "Yes," I said calmly, cutting another piece of turkey. "Busy, but not too busy to remember where I come from." That last part wasn't an accident. I wanted them to feel it, to remember every slight, every rolled eye, every whispered comment they thought I hadn't heard. My wife, seated quietly a few seats away, looked at me with eyes that glimmered with unspoken pride. For years, she had endured their dismissals on my behalf, defending me in subtle ways, trying to soften their treatment. And now, finally, she was seeing them forced to face what they had refused to believe, that the man they had belittled was the man others called visionary. The guest continued, his energy unshaken. "Do you remember that dinner years ago, when half the board doubted your projections? I'll never forget the way you held your ground. They laughed then too, didn't they?" "They did," I said evenly, my gaze flicking briefly to the family. "But I've learned that laughter often comes from fear of what people don't understand." The table shifted uncomfortably. My words were for him, but they hung in the air like smoke, impossible for the others not to inhale. It was almost poetic, the symmetry of it. Years ago, they had laughed when I had sat at this table. Now, another man remembered a different table, another laughter, one that I had silenced with persistence and vision. Dinner dragged on. The once boisterous conversations were replaced by awkward attempts to join in. An aunt leaned forward, voice too bright. "So when did all this happen? I mean, you never mentioned." "I never needed to." I cut in gently though firmly. "My work speaks for itself." Her smile faltered, the color rising in her cheeks. She retreated into her seat, stabbing at her vegetables as though they had personally offended her. I wasn't cruel. I didn't need to be. Their discomfort wasn't born from anything I said, it was born from the mirror suddenly held up to them, showing every arrogant assumption, every careless slight. As I chewed slowly, I let my mind wander back to the years they hadn't seen. The late nights in half-lit offices, hunched over spreadsheets no one believed in. The rejections from investors who said I was dreaming too big. The debts I shouldered quietly, the sleepless nights when even my confidence trembled. They had never seen me pacing the floor at 3 a.m., running numbers over and over, determined not to fail. They had never watched me turn failure into fuel, rejection into fire. They had never seen me put everything on the line, refusing to back down when the world told me I wasn't enough. And yet, here they sat, acting as though I had appeared in this role overnight, as though my title were luck rather than blood, sweat, and scars. The guest interrupted my thoughts, raising his glass slightly. "To vision," he said warmly, looking directly at me, "and to those who turn laughter into silence." I raised my own glass in response, the clink sharp and clear in the stillness. Around the table, hands hesitated before lifting glasses, their toasts weak, hollow, forced. My wife smiled softly then, her hand brushing her glass as if she wanted to reach for mine across the table, but couldn't in front of him. I caught her glance, and it was enough. The rest of dinner blurred into a strange dance of forced conversation. They tried, one by one, to weave me into their words, but it was clumsy, transparent. A cousin asked about travel for work, as though he hadn't mocked me years ago for having too much free time. And uncle asked if I enjoyed the challenges, as though he hadn't dismissed me as lucky when I married into the family. Each attempt only highlighted their hypocrisy, their desperation to rewrite the narrative now that the truth was undeniable. I answered politely but briefly, never giving them more than they earned. My restraint was sharper than any accusation. As dessert was served, I leaned back, observing them. The polished family, who had always prided themselves on status, now exposed as small in the presence of someone they had tried to belittle. Their wealth, their careers, their pride all shrank when measured against the quiet recognition of the man they had forced into the kitchen. And I realized something then. Revenge didn't need to be loud. It didn't need to be cruel. Sometimes, the greatest revenge was patient, the kind that let truth reveal itself at the perfect moment. When the guest finally rose to leave, he clapped me on the shoulder with the easy familiarity of equals. "I'll see you next week," he said, "and I look forward to your presentation. The board's lucky to have you." He didn't look at them. Not once. The door closed behind him, and the silence returned, heavier than before. I set down my fork, folded my napkin neatly, and looked around the table. Their faces were pale, stiff, trapped in the wreckage of their own arrogance. And I smiled. Not wide, not cruel, just a faint, knowing smile. Because the board wasn't the only place I held power anymore. The door clicked shut behind the guest, and with it, the last thread of their borrowed confidence snapped. His absence left a void, and into that void spilled silence, so heavy it felt like it pressed down on the very walls. For years, I had endured their chatter, their laughter, their easy dismissal of me as someone less than them. But now, not a single word dared to rise. They stared at their plates, their glasses, anywhere but at me. I placed my fork down with deliberate care, folding my napkin across my lap. The sound of fabric brushing the tablecloth was louder than their voices, louder than the clink of silverware. It was astonishing how much silence could reveal. Every breath, every twitch, every attempt to hide shame now rang louder than their laughter ever had. Finally, one of the uncles broke. His voice was too bright, too strained, the kind of tone a man uses when he's desperately trying to smooth cracks in a foundation already crumbling. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "that was unexpected." I met his eyes calmly. "For you, perhaps?" The words hung there, soft but immovable. His smile faltered, his wine glass trembling slightly as he lifted it to his lips. An aunt leaned forward then, her expression forced into warmth. "You never told us," she said, as though my silence were the betrayal rather than their years of disregard. Why didn't you ever share all of that? I studied her carefully. Would you have listened? The question struck sharper than accusation. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, but no words came. Because we both knew the truth, she hadn't listened when I tried to speak about my work before. None of them had. My words had been brushed aside, my accomplishments ignored, because in their eyes, I wasn't worth the weight of attention. One of the cousins, red-faced, tried to laugh it off. Guess we underestimated you, huh? His tone was meant to be light, but it carried the desperation of a man who knows he's already lost the game. I tilted my head slightly. Or perhaps you chose not to see. That silenced him. He stabbed at his dessert, eyes fixed firmly on his plate, his laughter dying before it could take root. I could feel their discomfort thickening with every second. And yet, a part of me felt no triumph in it. What satisfaction could there be in exposing arrogance that had always been hollow? They had spent years mistaking quiet for weakness, patience for insignificance. And now that truth had revealed itself, they were scrambling, clawing for excuses, searching for ways to rewrite history. But history remembers. I thought back to the nights they hadn't seen, the long hours spent in windowless offices, when my only company was the hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of my own determination. They hadn't been there when deals collapsed, when doors slammed in my face, when I mortgaged everything I had on a dream no one believed in but me. They hadn't been there when I sat with rejection letters spread across the floor, wondering if I had gambled too much, risked too much, asked too much of myself. They hadn't seen me wake before dawn to meet investors who dismissed me as naive, only to return home after midnight to try again the next day. They hadn't been there when I failed. And I had failed more than once, more than twice. Each failure carved lines into me, lines of resilience, of grit, of defiance. They had never seen the man who walked through fire to build what now stood unshakable. And yet, they had dared to laugh. Family first, I had said earlier. But the truth was, family hadn't come first here. Pride had. Appearances had. And I had paid the price for it, year after year in silence. Another uncle, the same one who had ordered me to carve the turkey, shifted uncomfortably. His voice was hesitant, almost pleading. You know, we were only joking before. It's tradition, you see. Sons-in-law, we all went through it. Don't take it the wrong way. I turned my gaze to him, steady, unblinking. A tradition meant to belittle is not tradition. It's habit. And habits say more about character than excuses ever will. His face darkened, but he said nothing more. He couldn't. The table felt smaller now. I had always been the outsider in this room, orbiting their circle, tolerated but never welcomed. But tonight, the orbit had shifted. They revolved around me now, their unease pulled toward the gravity of my presence. I didn't need to assert it. Power doesn't ask permission, it simply is. My wife watched quietly, her eyes never leaving me. She had known the weight I carried, the effort it took not to break under years of silent humiliation. And though she hadn't spoken, her silence tonight was different. It was not submission, it was vindication. The conversation limped along in broken fragments after that. They asked polite questions, shallow attempts at mending what had already shattered. I answered with the same calm composure I had given board members in hostile negotiations, measured, controlled, revealing nothing more than I chose. At one point, an aunt leaned forward again, her voice soft, syrupy. You've done so well for yourself. We're proud. The words might have carried weight years ago. But tonight, they felt empty. Pride spoken after years of disdain is not Prideite's opportunism. I met her gaze and simply said, Thank you. Nothing more. Because some words don't deserve to be dignified with more than acknowledgement. As the plates were cleared, I leaned back, letting my gaze drift across the table. Every face avoided mine, every smile brittle, every attempt at normalcy fraying at the edges. And in that moment, I realized something profound. Respect cannot be demanded. It cannot be forced through jokes, through hierarchy, through invented traditions. Respect is earned, and once earned, it cannot be denied. I had never needed their approval. I had never needed their validation. My worth had never been tied to this table, to these walls, to the brittle pride of people too blinded by their own egos to see clearly. But now they saw. The balance had shifted. The scales had tipped. And though they might try to rewrite the story, to soften their cruelty with excuses, nothing could erase the memory of their laughter colliding with the guests' words, freezing into silence. Dinner ended without ceremony. Chairs scraped against the floor, voices murmured awkward goodbyes. One by one, they left the table, retreating into corners of the house where their shame could breathe. I remained seated, calm, unshaken, the echo of silence still heavy in the air. And as I sat there, I knew this was not the end. The reckoning was not complete. For there is always one who cannot accept defeat, one who will try to reassert control even when control is gone. And when that moment came, I would be ready. The table had emptied of laughter, emptied of the self-assured arrogance that had once thrived here. Dessert sat untouched, melting into sweet puddles on fine china. Wine glasses lingered half full, their reflections distorted under the chandelier's light. Most of them had scattered into smaller conversations around the room, their voices hushed, their eyes darting toward me, and then away again as if contact might burn. The balance of power had shifted, and they didn't yet know how to live inside that new reality. But I knew what was coming. There is always one who refuses to accept change, who clings to the illusion of superiority even as it crumbles in their hands. The outburst never fails to aggravate, is as predictable as the tide. And when it came from the uncle who had ordered me to carve the turkey. He rose from his chair, face flushed with wine and wounded pride. His voice was louder than it needed to be, cracking through the quiet. "Enough," he said, his hand slamming against the table. "All this talk about business and boards and titles. We're family here, not employees. This is not the place to flaunt power." The room froze. Every eye turned toward him, though none dared agree aloud. I looked at him, my expression unreadable. "I didn't bring power into this room," I said softly. "It was here all along. You just chose not to see it." His mouth twisted. "Don't lecture us. You think a few successes make you better than the rest of us? You're still—" He stopped himself, but the word hung unspoken in the air. "Outsider. Servant. Less." I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm, measured. "Still what?" The silence that followed was unbearable for him, though I wore it like armor. His fists tightened at his sides, his face reddening further, but he couldn't bring himself to finish the thought. Because finishing it now would expose his arrogance, his blindness, his cruelty, all of it stripped bare under the truth. "I have never claimed to be better," I said, my voice steady, carrying through the room. "I have only worked. Worked when it was easier to quit. Worked when no one believed. Worked when laughter was the only response I received. I don't need to be better than anyone. I only need to be myself." My words settled into the silence, like stones dropped into deep water, sinking heavy and permanent. Across the room, I caught my wife's eyes. She wasn't hiding her pride now. It shone through her, clear and unwavering. The uncle sank back into his chair, defeated not by me, but by the weight of his own failure. His attempt to reassert control had exposed nothing about me, and everything about him. Dinner broke apart soon after. Goodbyes were mumbled, embraces forced, smiles brittle. They tried, some of them, to salvage dignity with polite farewells. But no farewell could erase what had transpired. The memory of their laughter turning to silence would live in these walls long after tonight. When at last my wife and I stood by the door, coats in hand, her mother tried one final attempt at reconciliation. Her voice was soft, almost pleading. "You'll come again, won't you? For the holidays?" I studied her face for a long moment. "If I do," I said evenly, "it will be because of her." I nodded toward my wife. "Not because of tradition, not because of obligation, and certainly not because of respect that only arrived after it was convenient." Her lips parted, but no words came. We stepped out into the night. The cold air met me like an old friend, bracing and honest in a way the warmth inside had never been. The stars hung clear above, sharp against the dark, a reminder that the world was far bigger than the narrow pride of one family's dining room. My wife slipped her hand into mine, her grip firm, steady. For a long moment, we stood in silence, the muffled sounds of the house behind us fading into nothing. "You didn't have to say all that," she whispered finally. "I know," I replied, "but some truths speak themselves when the time is right." She smiled, leaning against me. "I'm proud of you. I always have been." Her words carried more weight than any toast, any forced compliment. They were the words that had sustained me in darker times, the words I had carried with me when no one else believed. We walked toward the car slowly, the gravel crunching beneath our feet. And as I slid into the driver's seat, I let my gaze linger once more on the house behind us. For years, it had been a place of quiet humiliation, of forced endurance. Tonight, it had become something else entirely, not a throne of their pride, but a stage for their unmasking. And as I drove away, I realized something with a clarity that settled deep into me. Respect can never be demanded. It cannot be begged for, nor forced by title or tradition. It is earned in the silence of long nights, in the persistence that outlasts doubt, in the courage to keep going when laughter tries to stop you. I had earned it not from them, not even from the guest, but from myself. And that was enough. The night stretched ahead of us, vast and open. My wife's hand rested on mine, steady, certain. And for the first time in years, I left that house not as an outsider, not as a servant to their pride, but as myself, whole, unshaken, and free.